Okay, so here's part 4 of our Koi Fish Zentangle watercolor. And now I'm going to watercolor it. And I've chosen my paints. I'm going to use Prussian blue for the water, which is a really nice dark blue, and some yellowish green, some black, and some orange. And we'll see where we go from there. So if you don't have tubes, that is absolutely okay. You can definitely use whatever you have at home. Maybe you have something like this. That's perfectly fine. Just pick a watery color for the water. So I have my little tray here already set up. And I am going to quickly tape off my painting because I'm a very messy painter and I like really nice clean edges. So I'm going to use this green duct tape, which is the same stuff you use when you're painting. And I'm just going to put that on there real quickly. So we'll have a very nice clean edge. And now if you're using tape like this, and sometimes it'll rip up your paper, so you have to use really good quality paper, heavyweight paper. And if it seems like it's coming up, like it's ripping the paper, then you're going to want to use your hairdryer and just warm the tape up a little bit. And then it'll come right off. So, there we go. Alrighty. And I'm going to just start by painting the water around everything. Now, one thing you have to remember when you're watercoloring is, anytime you have a wet area, if you paint right next to it, it's going to bleed. So you want to get all your wet areas done and then let them dry before you paint anything next to it. So and yeah, I'm using a Prussian blue for the water. And I'm just going to fill in all the areas very carefully here. And I'm using an angled brush. You could use a round or any kind of brush you like. I like this one because you can get a really close, fine point, but also bigger areas. So anytime you're watercoloring, you want to make sure you start in one area and you work your way around. So I'm always moving that edge that's wet. Because if I were just to let this dry now and move over here, it would create this really sharp edge on it, and I don't want that. And I want the water to be a nice solid color. So I'm going to continuously move the wet edge and paint from one area all the way into the other area. And that's one way that you can get a more even tone. And now I'm using a really rough paper, which I love when I watercolor because it gives you this texture. So can you see the texture that the paper has? But there are a lot of different kinds of paper. But whatever you do, don't use copy paper, just your basic white paper, because it gets all wrinkly and it's terrible. And you can see that I'm painting this, but it's not starting to bubble up. It's because I'm using a 200-pound cold press paper, which you can get at Michael's or Hobby Lobby. I don't know if they're open during the crisis, but there's always Amazon. So I'm just going to finish painting in the little blue areas here. I think it would be pretty neat if you tried to paint the water black, but for this I decided to go blue. But I might do one with black just to see what it looks like. So you guys can mess around and decide what color you want for yours. So I'm going to just continue on here. And I usually like to do one wash and then let it dry. So I might go back later and put some darker areas in, do some more ripples or waves. And I'm using a pretty small brush for this because I have such small areas. But normally when you do a big wash, you want a bigger brush so you can move faster. But for this, I'm just going to use this little tiny one here. And like I said, whatever you guys have at home, just use that. This is just so you have something to do the next couple weeks. And it's funny when you're watercoloring, it dries pretty quickly, as long as you don't let it pool. If you're letting it get in big pooling areas, then it takes longer to dry. But if you're just kind of moving a little bit of amount of water around and not let it get too puddly, by the time you get all the way around, it should be dry on the other side. And then you can go back in and paint next to it without worrying about it bleeding. So that's pretty good. I'll let that dry. And I touched it with my hand over here and wrecked it. So let's just fix that real quick while it's still wet. And that looks good for me for the blue. Now while that's drying, I'm going to go in and do some of the green. Now for my lily pads, I'm going to switch to a silver brush here. A little bigger. And I have some green already mixed up here. So I'm just using this little tray, but you guys can use a plate or whatever you have. And this brush holds a little more water, so I'm just going to quickly come in and fill in all these areas here. Now I have two different colors mixed together, and I did that so that while it dries, it does a little bit of a granular thing where it gets kind of grainy and the color separates, which I think looks really neat. The higher quality watercolor paints will do that. And if you're using like a Daniel Smith, those are really nice. Really expensive, but they're very nice. And they do some really cool effects when they dry. And so for this, I mixed a yellow green and a peacock green. So I made this kind of green apple color. And again, I always let my first go wash dry, and then I'll go back in and put some glazing on. But for now, I just want to let it dry. Because whenever you're watercoloring, if you keep messing with a certain area while it's wet, you will destroy the paper, especially if you're using really thin paper. Now this stuff that I have is pretty thick. It'll take a lot of abuse, but that thin paper that they sell at Michael's and Hobby Lobby, if you're not buying high quality stuff, it will just start peeling up. And the beauty of watercolor is having this translucent look. So you don't really want it to be dark and chalky. So the more layers you put on and the more colors you mix, the darker and chalkier it gets. So keep that in mind when you're painting. You want to just paint quickly and let it dry. And just kind of enjoy the process. Otherwise it'll get muddy and it loses that pretty translucentness that watercolor has. We're almost done here with the greens. this is drying, I'm going to show you what I just got, which is pretty exciting. So I ordered this from Amazon. These are pearlescent, so they're metallic watercolors, and I haven't used them yet, but I figured I would use them. But it's pretty neat because it has this removable trays where you can take the little half pans out. So if you're traveling or whatever and you want to just bring a couple colors with you, you can. So I was thinking I would do the lily pad, kind of one of these pearlescent colors. So while my greens are drying, I'm going to try this. But you guys at home, you can use like a pink. I don't know, there's lots of colors that lily pads will go. So I'm just going to see what these look like real quick here while it's drying. So I'm just going to do a little pearly pink, and it's a very light color, but I like it. So I guess these paints have some form of mica in them. It makes them shimmer. Kind of neat. But if you're just using your basic watercolors at home, just do a really light pink. Like get a lot of water and a little bit of red to make a light pink, or use pink if you have it. So I know a lot of you just have the basic kind of Crayola sets. I was thinking it would be kind of neat on the fish to have some shimmery golden scales or something. So we'll see. The other thing to keep in mind when you're painting is if you make your paint too thick, it has too much of a saturated pigment in it. All that beautiful line work that you did will not show up when you paint over it. So you want to be careful not to have your paint too thick. You want to have enough water in it so you can see all your lines. Otherwise you'll lose all of that detail that you put in. All right. So there's my little pink flower, and I think I'll just do a yellow center, so I'm going to use permanent yellow light. And on my tray here, I already have some set up. I'm just going to pause real quick. What happened?